Good afternoon. How y'all feeling, South by? Okay, there we go. We're getting there. I am Greg Rosenbaum. I'm the Senior Director for South by Southwest EDU, and it's a true privilege to introduce our next speaker. As early in the pandemic, an expecting parent, and then a new dad, and then the father now of a 16-month-old, my lens into Emily Oster's work was through all that she's done to translate and decipher research for parents. When COVID struck, Dr. Oster's ability to help families and communities gain understanding from the data and make informed decisions helped communities across the country. I'm thrilled today that Dr. Oster will address the power of data, its limits, and what it means for education for all of us. As a quick reminder, we're going to be doing Q&A at the end of the session, so jump into the mobile app. There is an engage button, and that's where you can ask questions on Slido. Please join me in welcoming Emily Oster to the stage.
All right, thank you. I am so excited to be here to do something in person with people. So that is just an incredible thrill. And, thank you, Greg. That was a very nice introduction. I'll tell you a little bit of who I am. So my main job, my sort of professional identity is I'm a professor of economics at Brown University. And I also have a sort of another part of my life where I do a lot of writing about pregnancy and parenting and COVID. And I write a newsletter, and I just do a lot of things in that space. And sort of in some ways, when I look at the things I'm doing, they seem sort of disconnected. But actually, the piece that brings them all together, the sort of piece that goes across all parts of this, is the importance of data, and the importance of being able to use data thoughtfully and helpfully to answer questions, and the recognition that that usage of data is effectively the same, whether your question is, should I have an epidural with my pregnancy, or your question is, how do people respond to a diabetes diagnosis in terms of their food consumption, or if that question is, how should we think about the value of vaccines in the COVID pandemic? That a knowledge of data and understanding of data crosses all of those areas. And once you sort of recognize that, or to the extent that I recognize that, it makes me think that sort of a key to helping people navigate many of these spaces is understanding data, understanding what it can tell us, and in some cases what it can't tell us. And despite that, I find that in general, people's understanding of data is very poor. So I sometimes say, data is important, but nobody really gets it, or people don't always understand it as well as they could. And you might say, why does this matter? And one answer is just like, I'm obsessed with data, so of course I think it matters because it's the thing that I do, and we all think the things that we do are very important. So fair enough. But let me tell you why I believe that. I think there's really two reasons. So one is that I think that actually for a lot of people, we would make better decisions in our own lives if we had a better understanding of what we can learn from evidence. And so I think there's a sort of personal pitch to like, okay, invest in this so you can make choices that you are happier with. I think there is also a very key element, and this is in some ways where the kind of education part comes in here. I think if, as a society, we had a better understanding of some of these issues, it might be easier to make our societal decisions in a better or more informed way. And so, in particular, during COVID, this became in some ways very salient to me. I felt like a lot of the failures, or some of the failures at least, that we had in the US kind of related to not having the data, the information we needed to make good decisions. And I kept having the feeling if only people understood how important data is, we would have better data. There would be more pressure to get better information and let us make those decisions better. Sometimes when I say that, people are like, that's like a really naive thing to say. You're a person who loves data. Okay, fair enough. Maybe it's a little naive, but that's my pitch. So in light of that idea, so today I really want to go through kind of four big kind of data lessons, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of applications to COVID, but not exclusively. And really sort of these are kind of cases where sort of questions where I think it's possible to understand why they're important. It's not that hard to communicate that, but if we understood all of these better, we would be able to both communicate data better, to process data better, and to make better choices. So I'm going to talk about the question of where data comes from. I'm going to talk about the question of statistical power, the idea that correlation and causation are not linked and how we can kind of see that. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about Bayes' rule. And in all of these cases, I'm gonna kind of come in the angle here of like, how do I teach this to people? How would you convey this to people in a way that's not like, here's the math of what random sampling is, but sort of intuitively, how do we get to these, like, the understanding of these sort of key issues? All right, so let's start with where data comes from. And I'm reminding you that at the end we'll do Q&A. And so if you have your little app thing, you should ask questions, and then I will try to answer them later. And I'm happy to answer questions about more or less anything that you want. Okay, so let's get started. So where does data come from? So I want to start with this statement. This is a statement I pulled off some CDC website, some academic paper or something. CDC data indicates that 42.5% of adult Americans are obese. Right? So the CDC has a lot of statements like this, and it's on a website in which they report out some information about the health of the American population. So the question is, where would you get this? Like, where is this? How do we know this piece of information? And so, in some sense, the answer to that seems obvious. Okay, so we must somehow know it from weighing people, presumably people in America, based on and presumably adults in America, based on this sentence. So we weigh them, and we must also measure their height. That's how you get to a definition of obesity, and we calculate some number. Okay, so that's like roughly right. And the question is, well, like, who are you weighing? And sometimes I'll ask my students that, and they'll be like, well, I guess you weigh everybody, because it says adult Americans. And I say, well, did you get weighed? Like, did they come weigh you? No, nobody weighed. Okay, well, can't be everybody then. At least you personally were not weighed. And in fact, the answer to this question, sort of where does a number like this come from, is, in this particular case, a CDC survey called the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey that the CDC runs, and it covers about 11,000 people every year. So they weigh the 11,000 people, and they calculate their BMI, and they calculate the share of them that are obese, and then they kind of convert that into a number to be representative of the whole U.S. Population. So in some sense, this makes a lot of sense, and sort of statistically, like, of course you can't weigh everybody. That would be like practically impossible. And so you've got to have some system for using a smaller sample of people to extend up to everybody. But the key is how you pick that sample. If you want to weigh 11,000 people and make a statement like this that has some type of validity, you need to be pretty careful about how you pick those people. So, for example, one way we could pick those people is we could take everybody in a particular location. So we could go to Missouri or New York, or we could go to, you only need 11,000 people. You could go to, like, I don't know, like a Knicks game or a Nets game, or you just like go to some stadium and just weigh the people. It's so convenient, like this. Actually, NHANES is an enormous amount of work. They have all these, like, I don't know, mobile clinics and stuff. Like, why don't you just show up at some sports event with 11,000 people, you weigh them and you're done. That's it. Very fast, cheap. And of course, the problem with that is, like, well, that's not going to tell you about everybody in America. That's going to tell you about the people who went to the Nets game on that particular day. And I don't know how those people compare to the overall population. You could have sort of different approach. You could weigh everybody who's at the gym. Or what if you only weighed people who showed up to be part of your study, right? You said, well, come be in my study, which is about weighing people. And what kind of people show up for your study about weighing people? Not a random sample of people. You could only include people, and this is a little closer to maybe what we get to, you can only include people who picked up the phone when you called. All of these are ways in which our sampling would be non-random. And you can see, particularly with some of these sort of first couple of examples, why that kind of approach, why just doing something convenient is actually not going to lead you to the right answer. And it turns out that when you want to use a small sample to speak about a large sample, which is a very, very key part of using data and statistical methods, when you want to do that, you must think about sampling people randomly. You must have some way to get a sample that is representative of the population about whom you wish to speak. Now, maybe that seems very straightforward, but I would argue that during COVID, we totally fell down, particularly in the US, on that approach. So let's think about what I thought of as a very, very basic question that we had about COVID, which is, what is the case rate in a given state at a given time? And this turned out to be tremendously policy relevant, right? Many policies about what you should do or not do, or who can go to this thing or that thing, are based on this case rate number. It's a number like, what's the number of people who have COVID out of every 100,000 people? So it's, if it's above this, it's above that. So that was a very core number. And there are kind of two ways that we sort of think about it, getting that. And two ways you thought about measuring this. One is this case rate of the number of cases detected per 100,000 people. And that's something we often report. So we don't have a random sample for doing that, right? So this was a point that the former President Trump made early in the pandemic, which was that if you test more people, you will find more cases. And that has been weaponized as an argument, but it is in fact true that the places that do more testing end up finding more cases, because that's the way that works. And so if you measure cases in that way, you're going to get kind of one number, which is sort of non-random and depends on the amount of testing. The other way we measure sort of COVID rates is with something called the positivity rate. That's the share of the tests that show up positive. If we don't have a random sample, then that number is also kind of weird, because that's just the people who come. And so if you're not doing very many tests, the only people who show up may be people who almost certainly have it, because you're selecting that sample in a funny way. In a world with a random sample, where you were doing this with a random sample, these numbers would be the same. These things would line up. They wouldn't be literally the same number, but they would capture exactly the same thing. You would just, if you had your sample of 1 million people and you were testing them every week, you would get the same kind of number, no matter the same conclusion, whether you measured it with these case rates or with positivity rates. But in practice, because there was so much variation in how much we were monitoring the pandemic across states and time, we ended up with some stuff that looked pretty weird. So here's a graph that I made at some point of the relationship between the positivity rate, which is here on the vertical axis. So this is the share of tests that are positive. And on the horizontal axis is this measure of this daily case rate. Now, again, if this was if we had a random sample, these things would be there'd be a 45-degree line, right? It would just be on the line, because they would exactly line up with each other. In fact, you get things and I sort of highlighted a couple of things here. So you get things in South Dakota in November and in Arizona in January. I think these are 2020 and 2021. The case rate's the same. So these are both places with a case rate of 130 cases detected per 100,000. But the positivity rate, the share of tests that are showing up positive, is 50% in South Dakota at that time and about 15% in Arizona. And so what that kind of tells you is it must be the case that actually South Dakota has tremendously more COVID at this time than Arizona does, but they must be doing much less testing because half the tests they do are showing up positive. We have seen sort of similar things all over, that in some sense, we're seeing this case rate thing that we think of as this special measure that's measuring something is actually representing totally different things in different locations because we are not randomly sampling people. And so this problem continues to be true, and in fact, I think will in some ways be more true as we go forward, as we do less testing, as we do less monitoring of the pandemic. We're going to come up against these things, these things as we sort of move forward. Okay, so that's my first lesson, which is that that data comes from the world, but we need to randomly sample. All right, second lesson. Statistical power. And this is really a lesson about the ways in which data is, potentially limited. All right, so I want to start with the idea here of a randomized trial. This is probably sort of familiar to you guys, by this point of the pandemic, everyone kind of knows what a randomized trial is, but we're imagining we're having a randomized trial, which is a study in which we have a group of people and we randomly do one thing to one of them, set of them, and one thing to the other set. And the particular randomized trial I want to imagine is that you have your high school class and you randomly pick half of them to be forced to be on the cross-country running team for the semester. Okay, that's your treatment. And so we're going to divide the kids through some kind of random process, and half of them will have to be on the cross-country team. And the first outcome we're going to study is their ability to complete a 5K in under, that's 3 miles, in under 35 minutes. Okay. Now, this is not, and so then the question we're going to ask is how many people do we need to have? Like, how many kids do we need to include in our study in order to figure out if our treatment is statistically significant, if our treatment is having a statistical effect? So the kind of key here to thinking about this question is thinking about how large our effect size is. So in a case like this, probably if you took a bunch of high school kids and you made them be on the cross-country team, probably like most of them could run a 5K, or a lot of them could end up running a 5K within 35 minutes. That's not like that fast for a high school kid. So my guess is if you sort of reflect on this, the effect is probably very large. The difference between the sort of share of kids who can achieve this after a semester of like cross country and and the share who can achieve it without that, that's probably a pretty big effect. And what that means is that you actually probably don't need that many kids. Probably if you had a couple hundred kids in these two groups, you would be statistically powered, as we'd say, sort of formally, you'd be statistically powered to figure out whether there was an effect here. And the sort of larger is your expected treatment, the smaller is the kind of sample size that you need. But then we think about a sort of another version of this trial, in which it's the same treatment, but now what we want to study is the impact on people's blood pressure at the age of 50. So we're going to have these kids, we're going to make them be on the cross-country team, we're going to wait, and then when they're 50, we're going to find them. You're not going to be able to find them, but let's imagine you can find them. We're going to find them, and then we're going to measure their blood pressure. And the question is, like, how many people would you need to include here to be confident in the size to be confident in whatever effect you're going to find there? And the answer, again, depends on how big the effect is. But in this case, this effect is going to be really small. Maybe it's the case that running for one semester in high school makes your blood pressure lower at age 50, like could be, but a lot of other stuff happens between the age of like 17 and 50 that also affects your health. And so any effect size here is going to be like teeny, tiny, so small. And so that means if you want to be able to detect that tiny, tiny effect, you need like, I don't know, millions of people, right? You got to run this experiment on every child and every 17-year-old in America if you actually want to be able to figure out statistically, is there an effect here? And so, why is this important? Well, I think that understanding this gives us a sense of where we can expect confidence in the data that we see and where it's going to be very much harder. So the sort of example in the COVID space that I think is really, really important to sort of think about is the case of vaccines. So vaccines are something where we have good randomized trial data. That's how we learn about the efficacy of any kind of vaccine or medical treatment typically. When we look at older adults, when we look at like people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, actually you don't need an enormously large sample size to figure out the impact of COVID vaccines on hospitalizations or deaths, because that's a fairly, not common, but that is a somewhat more common outcome in that group. So when we look out in the world at data about our vaccines and how confident can we be about their efficacy in that group, and how tight can we draw our kind of confidence around numbers, we actually can draw it really tightly, because that is an outcome that is fairly common in those groups. When we have turned into something like, looked for something like, well, what kind of efficacy are we going to see in kids under 5? One of the things that we've run into there is that this is a group that has just really low risk of serious illness or mortality from COVID. That's extremely lucky on many dimensions. It makes the power really challenging. And so it means when people are looking to those studies and saying, okay, I'd like to, I want to be confident that we're able to detect an impact on hospitalization or an impact on serious illness, because that effect size is so small, you need really, really big samples to detect that. And because it's hard to get those very big samples, we are sometimes up against really just the limits of what we conceivably would be able to say with these kind of data. And this comes up again at sort of a related point, is that when we are trying to detect very rare complications of sort of anything, but in this case of vaccines, the rarer the complication, the larger the sample you need to detect it. And I think that sometimes that's sort of missed in some of these conversations. Okay, so that's the second lesson. Okay, so the third point I want to make, in some ways, is my favorite, and it is that correlation is not causation. So a lot of my academic research is about diet, and is about how we both understand the value of particular diet choices and how people make choices about diet. And I just look very interested in diet. And one of the key questions that we sort of ask, both as a kind of society when we're developing these kind of dietary guidelines, and as individuals, is just like, what is a good food? What is a healthy food? How should I be eating? What is like the right way to diet? So there's a lot of literature on this, a lot of papers that are written about the question of what is the best diet. And there is a very common data approach across all of these studies. So this approach goes like this. You interview people about their diet, and you ask them, what did they eat? And you ask them, turns out there's a very active question about how you can figure out what people eat. So one thing is you could have them write down everything they eat, but that's actually really hard, because once you ask people to write down what they eat, then they eat differently, or they lie, or both. And so it's actually really hard to have sort of, once you're keeping a food diary, you're like, oh, I probably shouldn't have so much ice cream today, or whatever it is. And so people aren't very good at that. So instead, what we use are dietary recall. So you say, okay, well, think back to last Tuesday and list all the things you ate last Tuesday. But people are also not very good at that. And they also forget a lot of the things they ate, or they don't want to tell you. So when you do studies like this, you're kind of understanding that you're going to be sort of incomplete. And so generally they show up with things like, I don't know, the average person in a study will eat 1,600, 1,700 calories a day, which of course is, kind of substantially lower than the average American's caloric consumption. But at any rate, you ask people about their diet, and you're kind of hoping that what they tell you is the sort of approximation of kind of what the truth is. And then you also weigh them, and you collect typically some other health metrics about them. And then these papers correlate. They will look at, in the data, a relationship between the diet choices and people's weight or health. So you ask a very simple question of when there is, when sort of among the people who eat this kind of food, are those people healthier or less healthy, more or less overweight, whatever is your outcome. And And typically then, when you are going to report out the results of this kind of study, you will look at whether foods are correlated with higher BMI, and if they are, you will sort of say they're unhealthy. So you'll have something like, people who eat too many Reese's peanut butter cups are that's bad for you because it correlates with a higher weight. So again, very, very common set of papers. So in sort of thinking about this, at some point I ran a set of very simple regressions associating individual foods with weight. And so here is kind of what you get in this sort of standard approach. So one thing is there's a lot of different kinds of lettuce that people eat. Okay? There's many different lettuce options. So one of the things you find is that people who eat iceberg and romaine lettuce, those tend to be associated with a higher BMI. So it's they tend to increase your weight. Whereas if you choose to eat arugula or dandelion greens, that will lower your BMI. Also, you have some different options for fat. People who eat margarine tend to have a higher BMI. People who eat butter, it's kind of neutral. But if you eat a lot of olive oil, that's going to lower your BMI. Also, sugar substitutes. I want to be clear, sugar substitutes are items which contain no calories. Okay, so these are 0-calorie items. That's actually also true of lettuce. Sugar substitutes, what we find is that people who report consuming chemical-based sugar substitutes, that's like Blenda, tend to have a higher BMI. Whereas people who consume plant-based sugar substitutes, like stevia, those people have a lower BMI. Okay? So you sort of look at all of this together, and it's like these things cannot actually be causal. Can it actually be the case that iceberg lettuce makes you fat? Iceberg lettuce is just water, okay? It's just like a crunchy water item. That's not a thing, right? And at the same token, margarine, olive oil, kind of similar. Sugar substitutes are literally all things with no calories. And so it can't be that these items, this is why I put them up, why I sort of use these here. It kind of can't be that these are really something we'd want to conclude causal relationships from. What's really going on is that the kinds of individuals, the sort of other characteristics of the individuals who consume these different foods are different in other ways. And so in this case, for example, when you look at what kind of individuals are consuming a lot of arugula and dandelion greens, it tends to be people with more education, it tends to be people who are higher income, it tends to be people who are doing all kinds of other things that are positive for their health, like exercise or other kinds of dietary choices, and separating out arugula specifically from, generally having a healthy diet or exercising or being a person with access to medical care. These things are basically almost impossible to do in the data. One of the things that I work on, the last pre-pandemic paper I wrote before I started working only on COVID, was about what happens but the way in which these kind of things can occur through information sharing. So one of the things that you see is when we start telling people that something is healthy, the people who adopt that behavior tend to also be the people who are doing all of the other healthy things. And so we get our results, our sort of relationships that we see in the data get more and more and more biased as a result of the messages that we are sending. So if you look back at the 1980s and you look at the relationship between sugar and obesity, it's actually pretty flat. And part of that is because there was actually this sort of current moment of sugar is the devil, was not as true in the 1980s when the complete breakfast was a bowl of Frosted Flakes and a juice and a jam toast. You remember? It was this is when my childhood was the complete breakfast had a tremendous amount of sugar in it. Now the complete breakfast is 2 egg whites and an avocado toast. And so at that point, in this sort of early period when sugar was not the enemy, you did not see much of a relationship between sugar and weight. In the current moment, you see a tremendously large relationship between sugar and weight, and simultaneously you see that the relationship between education and sugar consumption has changed a lot, that the relationship between cigarette use and sugar consumption has changed a lot, relationship between exercise and sugar consumption has changed a lot, that as we told people, don't eat sugar, the people who stopped eating sugar were the people who were also doing all these other things. And that makes these kind of relationships even more challenging to pick up in the data because they are sort of effectively a moving target. I was explaining this research to one of my graduate students the other day, and he was like, "Are you telling me that we don't know anything about what we should eat?" And I was like, "Yeah, basically, yeah. I mean, you know, pretty much. That's what it is. Don't smoke cigarettes." That's what we got. All right, so this of course comes up in COVID, and it comes up sort of most, I think, in how we think about the relationship between COVID and these on the sort of whole suite of what people call non-pharmaceutical interventions. Right, so a whole suite of things that we do that kind of aren't vaccines or drugs, but are behaviors, lockdowns, masks, school closures, no indoor gatherings, all the kinds of sort of like societal restrictions. Part of what's been very challenging about thinking about which of those we should turn on and off and when we should turn them on and off is that it's very, very difficult in the data to separate these things from each other or from any other characteristics of the population. So like an example, not to like pick on masks, but a good example of this is there's a paper from the CDC a couple weeks ago in which they correlated mask use with COVID rates, and they argued that people who used masks were much less likely to have COVID, and that was sort of true in some correlational sense, in the same way that iceberg lettuce is correlated with being overweight. But what was less true was that you could make a causal claim there. And so in particular, in that case, most of the people who used masks were also being tested for their job, whereas most of the people who did not use masks were being tested because they were sick. So there was this very obvious confound, which was just like, what are the characteristics of these people? There's a bunch of people who need to do surveillance testing for their job and a bunch of people who are coming to your testing site because they're ill. And those things were very highly correlated with mask use. Again, it's not, in a case like that, it's not that would tell you masks don't work or do work. It's just like there's no information conveyed, which is in some sense the same point as with the kind of foods. It's not that dandelion greens aren't good for you. They could be good for you. And if you enjoy eating a stringy hemp-like substance with a little garlic, like that's fantastic, enjoy yourself. But it isn't obvious from the data that that's true. And I think the same is true of some of what we see about these non-pharmaceutical interventions. And because that's hard to understand, I think we have generated so the only reason. But one of the things that's happened because our data on this is poor and because we have struggled to really like get to anything factual, it has meant that the sort of data hole has been filled with politics. And in a world in which you don't know what the answer is, it's very easy for people to sort of cherry pick pieces of flawed evidence on both sides and say, this shows that I'm right, because if there's one thing people like, it is to be right. So I think this is a place where I feel like if we had a better approach, had a different approach, we might have been able to understand this better. There you go. Ooh. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about before we answer questions, and you guys should put putting your questions in the thing, is Bayes' rule. And here I'm gonna make you answer a question. So you answer the questions. So okay, so we're gonna have a disease. Let's say there's a disease that affects 1 in 10,000 people. And we have a really, really good test for this disease. This is a test that detects 99.9% of cases of the disease, and it has a 2% false positive rate. So sort of to put that in your mind, means 99% of the time we get it right, and then there's this sort of small chance of a kind of false positive. And now we imagine we're testing somebody, and their test is positive. So what is the chance that they have the disease? Somebody yell a number. Say, yell it louder. 98%. Okay, 98% is a very common answer. I'll take some other answers. 50%, good answer. Also very common. 0.00, okay. So we got a good range between 98 and 0.0001. And when I do this in class, I usually get about that range. Sometimes people will say 100%, which are quite, or 0. Usually we get the whole range, but okay. So the question is like, what is the answer? And the answer is 0.5%. So think about why this is true. And it's like, it's actually, I think it is possible to intuitively get to the point where you get this. Let me walk through it. So we've got our 10,000 people. Let's assume, to make this a little simpler, that the test is perfect. Perfect in the sense of detecting every single case. So rather than 99.9, it's 100% effective at detecting cases. So we get 10,000 people, and one of them has the disease. So the test picks up that person for sure. So for sure, we find out that that person has the disease. Now there's this 2% false positive rate. Now that number seems small, but there's 10,000 people here. And so 2% of that 10,000 people is 200 people. So when you run this test, one person you're gonna pick up who's like a true positive, and you're gonna pick up 200 false positives. And so now you have 201 positive test results, and only one of those people has the disease. So it's about a half of 1%. The intuition here, which is really, really challenging, I think, unless you sort of like, once you work it through, it's easy to see the numbers, but it's very hard to see this intuitively. And the intuition, or so the kind of thing that's driving this, is that this is rare, that this disease is just uncommon, right? And so even with a very limited false positive rate, most people don't have this. So when you like show up, it's very unlikely. So even if the test provides a tremendous amount of information, it started out being super unlikely, and so now it's quite a bit more likely, actually. Like the difference between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in 200 is very, very large. But it is still really unlikely because we started at this very, very unlikely place. This comes up in various ways all the time. And the sort of example outside of the COVID context that came up very recently was the New York Times published a very big kind of expose, effectively, on prenatal testing, which was about how there are many new prenatal tests for unusual conditions, for like sort of rare microdeletions or other kind of potential genetic conditions that are really, really, really uncommon. And there's now much better ways to test for those conditions. But the thing is that those conditions are really, really, really uncommon, and the tests are not perfect. And so the New York Times story was about the fact that many people test positive on these tests and turn out not to have the conditions, just like in this example. But of course that's true. That is exactly how the tests are designed, right? So that is like a completely 100% expected. That is how this should work. If you have a test, have a condition that's very rare, and you have a test with some false positive rate, you will learn a lot from the test, but you won't learn everything. And because it's so rare, it still could be really, really likely that actually everything is fine. And what was sort of interesting about the expose here was that I think for me, it revealed not the pitch of the article, which was like, these prenatal tests are terrible and they're ruining people's lives, but in fact, nobody understands Bayes' rule. Because if you had just kind of understood Bayes' rule, you wouldn't have been surprised by any of this. And in fact, instead, what was happening was that people and their doctors were kind of reacting to this information in the sort of 98% way, or at least in the 50% way, rather than in the sort of closer to 0.0001% way, because of this sort of misunderstanding of what we can really learn from these kind of tests. And it has real implications, because one of the implications is that people say, well, actually, I don't want that test. I don't want that test because it's not perfect. But that test provides a lot of information. We just need to know how to process the information. And we're running the risk of throwing away pieces of information like that because we are not able to engage with them effectively. There's a kind of just broader picture around Bayes' rule that I think is sort of worth making as my kind of final point before we do questions, which is that when we talk about this, the kind of key input is what we technically call our priors. So in this example here, your prior is the risk before you took the test. So there's some prior chance that you had it. Here it's like 1 in 10,000. And every time we come into sort of some new information, we come into it with some priors. We come into learning that piece of information with an expectation about how likely is it that this information is true, or what did I think about this relationship before I saw this new piece of information? Or at least that is how we should do it. So it should be the case when we see a new study about something that we like file away in the back of our mind all of the things that came before, and we like incorporate this new piece of information in the context of all of those things. And what that should mean is if every other thing you have seen in your entire life points you in one direction, and then there's one piece of evidence that comes in that points in another direction, unless that piece of evidence is like wildly compelling and a billion times better than all this other stuff, it shouldn't make you totally flip-flop over to everything else, to something new. It should move your prior. It should maybe move you in some direction. But we should be influenced by what has come before. I think that there is often so much of a kind of like newness value, or like, what's the latest thing? I want to do the latest thing, that we can sometimes forget that the latest thing might just sort of like be a false positive, or we shouldn't only listen to the newest thing. And this, again, is something that I think drove, in some ways, a lot of the sort of lurchy changes that we saw during many aspects of COVID, that we would sort of, a new piece of information would come out and would be like, okay, now we're like all in on that. So, here's one new study from, Liechtenstein that says the following, and now we're gonna like all do things totally differently until the next new study comes out the sort of next day, as opposed to saying, look, we're gathering together pieces of information from a lot of places, and we're trying to sort of have them as a kind of moving, as a moving target, and incorporate new pieces of information at any given time and update what we know. Instead of that happening, what happened was we went from, no mask to all masks, to no mask to all masks, or, vaccines are 100% protective in all situations, like a titanium shield, to like, well, they don't work at all, and actually they work really well. So sort of like back and forth in these ways that are not helpful for public health messaging and for people's understanding of what's going on. So, I think in some ways, the sort of big message that I would sort of like to kind of send here is this idea that if we understood the underpinnings of data better, we would be better at moving it out into varying situations. We'd be better at the sort of situational fluency of understanding the information that comes in and being able to process it for what it is and see where is it limited, where is it good, where can I learn from it. And I think that when we teach, we don't do enough. We don't do enough data. So, I think the other people push for this in different ways than I do, but I think, when I think about what high school kids are learning, I kind of wish they did more data and maybe like like a little less trigonometry, or at least we could like have both of them, because these kinds of things come up in how we understand our world. And if people had a deeper knowledge of it, it doesn't have to be infinitely deep. It's not infinitely complicated. I don't think that we need everybody to know exactly how to calculate, exactly what the like mathematical formulation of Bayes' rule is, or exactly how to calculate the statistical power that you'd need in a randomized trial given the effect size and the standard deviation or whatever it is. We don't need to know that. But what we need to know are these intuitive messages, and that's something that can be conveyed, and it can be conveyed in ways that are real for people, that people can sort of see. And I think that's kind of the key to getting there, is to have people see the ways that this is relevant to the stuff that they're reading every day or they're seeing every day sort of out in the world. So let me stop there, and I will take questions. I'm happy to take questions about data, but I'm also happy to take questions about the work I've done over COVID, or the work I've done about pregnancy, or I don't know, whatever you want. Okay. I think that the deal is I'm going to read the question and then try to answer it based on your upvotes. Oh, and you can upvote the question, so then I will know what's a good question. Okay, so I'm going to start with this because I think it's really important. So how do you communicate these important uncertainties without eroding trust in science more generally? That is like an incredibly important question, and I think part of what has happened that has been very sad for the data side of this over the pandemic is this erosion of trust in science. This idea that like, you guys don't know anything. Every day you come up with a new thing, and you just like what is this? You're just like kind of doing whatever. And how can I trust science if it changes all the time? And I think that in some ways, I think the communication of uncertainty is the key to trust. So one of the biggest challenges is in public health, we are almost always trying to give people certainty, even when we do not have it. So we're trying to give people clear and specific guidance, and of course a lot of value to clear and specific guidance, but if you tell people one thing and then the next day you tell them something different, even though those are both very clear, you have eroded your trust. So when I was writing about little kids, one of the things that one of the sort of biggest shifts in kind of like this, almost like the science around parenting in the last decade has been a move to introduce allergens to kids early. So people used to be told, don't give your kids any peanuts because it will make them allergic. And then we got a bunch of new information in which actually not giving your kids peanuts makes them allergic. So you should give them peanuts like almost immediately, like just out of the womb, just like put the peanuts on them. And that change, I think for a lot of people was like, I had my two kids like on either side of that. And we went from like one really sharp message to another really sharp message. And there, saying why is like the whole thing. I think that's also true in a lot of these places, that being able to say, like, this is why we changed, or, we're going to change our guidance, and here is the information that caused us to do this, and here is how good that information is, and here is when you can expect us to get more information, which might change our guidance in another way. And I think that communication of uncertainty is kind of a big piece of the trust that we sort of, that it's not in the way of trust, it like should be the trust. What is one of the most surprising conclusions that you found in your work with data about raising children? Yeah. So, I mean, I think generically, I'm surprised at how little of the sort of small things matter. Particularly as a person who kind of like obsesses about every tiny thing in my own parenting, there is a sobering aspect of realizing that most of the things are kind of probably totally irrelevant in the data. So I guess that's kind of a negative comment. I think one of the things that's maybe not so much surprising but puzzling is that when you look out at the world, it is very clear that what we do with our kids in the first sort of 3 years of life in some way must matter a tremendous amount, because when we look at sort of inequalities and when we start seeing inequalities across kids based on family background or other characteristics, they show up really early, right? They show up by the time kids are showing up in schools. So there's got to be some stuff going on that we could think about affecting at a policy level that's really important in early childhood. And yet, when you dig into any individual choice, it's very difficult to find anything that matters. And so that sort of juxtaposition of like, obviously this is very important, but I cannot figure out what aspect of it is important. I think it's not so much that's like surprising, it's just, it's a puzzle. It's something that I think that we could understand better. It'd be much easier if you could say, here are all the things that matter, and that we kind of know why this is important. But to say, we know that it must be important because we see such big differences across kids based on their early life environment, and yet we cannot point to much of any particular thing that matters. I think that is surprising. That's not often true in the way that we think about data. Okay, what issues, if any, do you see in common research practices in the US when it comes to inclusion of marginalized folks and the validity of data because of that? Yeah. Okay, that's a really good question. So sort of big picture issue is that it is common to not include marginalized groups in research or to include them at lower levels. And sometimes that is, I'm not sure I would refer to this group as marginalized, but sometimes there are sort of particular groups that you don't include in research just because of like pregnant women, or kids, because of other things that sort of other reasons people are concerned. And then sometimes it's like, well, it's hard to find people. If you sort of think about a big research study on almost anything, it usually involves like, there's a lot to do, and there is a lot of effort in finding people, and there are some communities that are harder to find than others, and that is a reason why we end up in a situation in which we are overrepresented, particularly of white people and to some extent men, in a lot of the kinds of studies that we do. And I think the problems that generates are very clear. You take something like breast cancer, the way that breast cancer, the sort of types of breast cancer that more frequently show up in Black women, very different than the types of breast cancer that more frequently show up in white women. And so we have a situation which we're kind of not studying, where when studying one of those groups is really not as helpful as it might be for understanding the experiences and the risk to the other group. And then if we exclude that group, then we are not making progress there. And so I think there's not a solution inherent in that. I think you're absolutely right that it's like an incredibly important problem. How would you explain Bayes' rules to a fifth grader, making it accessible to those less knowledge about data principles? Okay, I have a fifth grader, and I assume if I tried to explain Bayes' rule to her, she would tell me that not to be boring, but let me try. So I think my first grader might like it better, actually. So I think actually I would probably do it in some ways similar to the sort of example I gave in this room, because I think it's the sort of seeing of the numbers and seeing it sort of visually, where like you can kind of, maybe not with 10,000 blocks, but there's a sort of way to do this with blocks that makes it like super vivid, and that I think is kind of always the way into that. Depends a little bit what your fifth grader is doing, and you probably want like a good example that they care about, but I can't think of what that would be. I'm going to think about that question. Haley, that was a good question. Okay. I looked for data on TV and children, and I couldn't find anything. What say you? Huh. TV is great. No. So most of our evidence on TV, most of the kind of studies that you'd have about television and kids, is subject to a lot of the kinds of biases that I talked about in the food stuff. So there's a very strong kind of correlation is not causation thread in all of that literature, where you see kids who watch a lot of TV, and they tend to do worse on tests than kids who don't watch a lot of TV. But like, how much of that is about the differences across families and how much TV they like the kids watch, and how much is about the TV? It's kind of hard to suss that out. Better controlled studies don't typically show very significant effects of television in any particular direction. So that's kind of, I guess that part is kind of encouraging. The way that I sort of have thought about this in writing about it is to sort of encourage people to think about television as an activity that is not fraught with the kind of like emotional baggage that screen time for kids has often taken on. So, rather than thinking about TV as something that is inherently good or bad, think about it as an activity that takes time, and that time could be spent doing something else. And that means that, all time has what economists would call an opportunity cost. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't do some of it. And so, like, if you think about television as not watching TV, but staring at a wall, if you think about like basically how much of the day, like would you be okay if your kid said that for 45 minutes before dinner every night, I just want to go sit in my room and like stare at the wall? You would be like, my kid's such a great meditator. They go and they stare at the wall. I mean, I'm not that, it's just nice for them, And also you'd be like, oh God, I really need a break. Thank God they're watching television. They're staring at the wall. It's so amazing. But of course that has the feature that's like, why is that different from TV? It's a little bit different, of course, because they want to watch TV and they don't want to stare at the wall. But in the sense of it sort of displacing something else, it has that same feature. And so if we sort of put that in put it in that frame, I think it makes it a little easier to think about, okay, there's probably a time in your day in which TV is a reasonable thing to do, and probably having your kid spend all of their waking hours that are not at school watching TV is going to get in the way of other things you'd want them to do, like talk to you or eat meals or go outside or whatever it is. So I think just like TV is not inherently bad, but it does take time. That's kind of how I'd put it. People in general are nervous speaking about data when they aren't confident in this space, including teachers. How do we empower teachers to teach these topics? Focused education. I think that this is a place where like it's absolutely like it is always, I mean, like all of us, when you're up in front of somebody teaching something and you aren't really sure about it, that's like the worst kind of teaching, right? Where people ask a question, you're like, I don't know, it could be anything. And so I think we really need to like dial in not just sort of curriculum approaches for kids, but training for teachers, ways to kind of help people think about, how do I do these modules? How do I explain Bayes' rule to a sixth grader? How do I how do I get these across in a way that is like interesting and active for the student, but also how do I understand it in a deeper way, so I'm not just like one chapter ahead of the kids, but actually sort of have this understanding. So I think the answer is to develop teacher trainings while we develop curricula for students, rather than to just hand people a curriculum and say, just make sure you've read it all in advance, which is really not enough to be able to teach something. I think we all kind of know that. How does the average person ask themselves, is this data or study presenting itself without biases? No data or study is presenting itself without biases. So first question you ask is, that never happens. But I think there are some things that we can sort of look at to try to understand better, like, is this new fact that I'm seeing like a real fact or something that I should believe? One is some of the kind of standard, like, is it a randomized trial? Is it big? Was it published in a journal that I've like heard of, which would be like JAMA or NEJM, if it's in the medical space. So I think that's often where I tell people to go, like, does this sort of seem like it has the sort of tick boxes of something good? And then I think the other thing is, in a lot of studies that are not randomized, you just want to like think, just like use your brain to think a little bit about how likely is it that this treatment, that this difference across these groups is kind of random, right? We're always, when we're looking for causality in particular, we're always relying on a component of randomness, of some way in which whatever is different between the groups has to have some random element. If you can't think of what that would be, it's probably not causal, I think is kind of where I would come down on it. Okay. Oh, I'm getting. They put up a big sign that says wrap up here. So, okay, I'm going to do that. But you got to put the questions back up because I'm going to answer one more question. No. Okay. All right. I'm not going to answer one more question. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. This was such a tremendous pleasure, and I really appreciate you all being here. And enjoy the rest of your amazing conference.